think the opening session is very important. There's good research in psychotherapy that you set the tone for what's going to happen within the first session or two. And so from the very beginning, there are particular things that one needs to be doing that we can talk about. It's almost like in a chess match. We've made this analogy together. There are certain things you do as opening strategies. There are other things that are characteristic of the middle of the process and then analogous to our phase two. There are things that you do at the end of the process. And so what we'll focus on in this tape is the opening strategies, what it is that one does up front. But I think first it might be useful to talk about things not to do, traps to avoid that one can fall into in an opening session. So perhaps we ought to reflect on those a bit in opening.
Well, one that over the years is increasingly striking me as important is avoiding a premature focus trap. And in a funny way, the more specialist the practitioner or counselor is, the more likely they are to fall into that trap. In other words, the client comes to you and you assume that if you are a specialist in something, whatever it is, that's what you talk about. And very often they're broader concerns. And there's a need to start broad and not prematurely focus into your particular area of expertise, let's say tranquilizer use, and even worse, the question of why don't you do something about it. So premature focus can be interpreted in different ways, but at its heart is the need to start broad and understand why the person's come.
And it's almost, within an assumption, it's almost like the person thinks that they're already at the readiness stage. You just assume they're ready to go. You're coming to a specialist, you must be ready to change, and so you charge straight into talking about the problem without doing this preparation.
Like a woman who's been sexually abused as a child, who's a single mother with 2 little kids with behavior problems, who's depressed and who also drinks. Comes to a specialist unit because the family medicine physician thought it was a good idea. Why alcohol?
Why not the other concerns that she has?
Why not the others? And that's a good example of it.
Yeah. What might be thought of as the mother trap of them all, the one that's certainly most central to motivational interviewing, is what we call the confrontation denial trap, where the professional falls into the role of explaining why change is necessary, arguing for it to happen, making the case that it needs to happen, which leaves the client in the opposite role. If a client comes into a session ambivalent and you argue for change, the person is very likely just reflexively to argue against change, which is counterproductive. And so that's one to avoid as well, to avoid putting oneself in the position of being the champion of change and leaving the client the undesirable role of arguing against it.
And it can be difficult, that, because if you're feeling enthusiastic and bright and it's a new day and you've got a client coming and you think, right, I'm going to do good work here, it can be very easy to slip into taking that role.
Yes.
Whether you're giving someone advice in a very brief medical encounter or indeed engaged in a much more intensive therapy process with someone.
Yeah.
It's quite easy to slip into that.
I think also, and this one can be related, about labeling. This is emphasized more in certain specialties than others, but in my own field of addictions, there's been a great deal of emphasis placed on having a person admit or accept a certain diagnosis. You have a problem with gambling, you are an alcoholic. There isn't really any scientific reason to believe that that is particularly useful. Many people get better without taking that labeling step, and there are many people who accept the label who don't get better. So it is, in a way, a specialized case of the confrontation denial trap to try to cause the person to accept a certain diagnosis. And we've tried just to bypass that and not emphasize labeling at the beginning, because it is a premature focus.
Yeah, that's fundamental.
Yeah.
Perhaps a bigger problem in North America than in Europe. I'm not sure.
Could be.
Possibly.
Yeah. And then what about blaming? The person may come into the session believing that the agenda here is to find out who's at fault for this problem having happened. And I think it's important somehow to diffuse that process.
Now, that can be a subtle business.
Yes.
I mean, if someone comes in and they feel blamed by a spouse That's quite obvious. You can fall into a blaming trap there by siding with the spouse. But if they're coming in and you're just talking about their problem, sometimes the very act of talking about problem makes them feel blamed. I don't know. It can take subtle forms.
It seems more likely to happen if two people are coming in also.
Yeah.
If you're seeing a couple, they may come with the thought that this person is going to figure out which one of us is at fault here. And so it can be important to diffuse that very quickly.
I mean, might not just be you blaming the person. The critical issue here is they feel blamed,
Right.
whatever the cause of that. Another trap, which is a primitive one, I think. If the confrontation denial trap is the mother of them all, this is the primitive one, which is the question-answer trap. I say primitive because things are going seriously wrong if the dance that is taking place between yourself and the client sounds like da-da-da-da-da-da-da from you, and then ba-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba from the passive client. And all the ramifications of the counselor having control, client becoming increasingly passive.
It's a very easy one to fall into. And asking questions is such a tempting thing to do, and it feels helpful. And yet there is this risk in it. One of the practical rules we've used is never ask 3 questions in a row.
Yeah.
You should be listening and following what the person is saying instead of just question, question, question. Especially if you open your session that way by asking a lot of questions in a row, you begin to set the basis for what is the other trap we have to talk about, which is the expert trap.
Absolutely.
Where you set yourself in an uneven position with the person. By asking a lot of questions, you announce, even subtly, I'm the expert here and you're the passive recipient, and as soon as I'm done asking questions, I will have the answer for you. That has its limitations.
Serious limitations. I mean, it's ironic, isn't it, that with a problem, behavior change, which is so obviously difficult for the individual to effect in the outside world, where they require such activity, energy, and commitment, we might want to deal with it by rendering them passive in the consultation.
Yes.
It's obvious that what we want to try and do is make them as active and as charged up in the consultation as possible.
Now, I can imagine a physician, for example, saying, but I do have the answer. I mean, I am an expert, and it is a matter of my telling the person, here's the antibiotic you need, or here's what you need to take. What about that?
Well, I think what that physician or that expert has, that expertise in the realm of behavior change, is information and access to scientific evidence and access to experiences of what works for other people. But that's about it. And so that's not incompatible with using something like motivational interviewing at all. That's a process of exchanging information with someone, which is the subject of one of our videos. And that can be done in different ways. And it can be done in a domineering, imposing way, or it can be done in a way in which the doctor's expertise is used to enhance the energy and commitment and searching of the patient.
And so much of what comes to the attention of a physician these days has to do with behavior. And the solution to it has to do with behavior. Even if it's as simple as taking your medication, which turns out not to be that simple sometimes. But many of the problems that come back and back are lifestyle issues that involve behavior. So it's there, I think, that this approach may be useful, even in what seems like a preset expert passive recipient setting.